A few years ago I built a mini harpsichord called an Ottavino. Apparently they call it that because it's tuned an octave higher. They've never been known as serious musical instruments, but wow, they sure look cool. That first instrument I built was technically an Ottavino Virginal, where the strings run from left to right and the case was rectangular. This time I'm going to use a different design called a Spinet, where the strings run at an angle and so the case is sort of triangular. The casework is going to be more tricky, but the inner workings should be a little easier. And yeah, I'm going to make 3 of them at the same time. Let's start with the base. I'll use the bandsaw to cut the angled back edge and to make these cutouts for the projecting keyboard. Next we need to make a dado across the inside of the base. A part called the rack is going to sit in this dado later. The back, left, and right sides all need to be mitered at 21 degrees from vertical. This angled shape makes building the Spinet a lot more challenging than building the Virginal, which was a simple rectangle. For the 2 front corners, which are at 90 degrees, I'll use a rabbet joint. The front of the case needs a cutout for the keyboard. On each side, I'll mark where the projecting cheeks will be to locate the cutout. It's going to be much easier to veneer the case parts before assembly. There's going to be trim molding on all the edges, so let's first use the molding to mark off where the plywood gets veneered. I've posted another video demonstrating how to do this fancy veneer work called marquetry. I'm trying hard to keep this video under 20 minutes, so let's not get into it here. We also need to veneer the inside of the case before assembly. These angled pieces are very awkward to glue and clamp together. I did the right angled front corners first, glued that to the base, and then attached the back piece. Some small screws will bring strength to the joints. Next, let's make all the trim molding in solid walnut, starting with these corners. The 2 front corners are 90 degrees, but the 2 back corners are angled. One is an acute angle and the other is obtuse. To make the obtuse angle, bevel each side at about 35 degrees, no problem on the table saw. For the acute angle though, the bevel is about 55 degrees and the saw blade just doesn't tilt that far. Mount the piece vertically with some double-sided tape and set the blade to a complementary angle, 35 degrees. Once the corners are glued together, you can route some decorative fluting. Stop and start blocks on the router table ensure that each flute is at the same height. After gluing on the corners, we can next make the top molding. It has a shallow rabbet made on the router table, creating a small overhang on the outside. A round over bit softens the overhang with a small curve. The overhang also needs to be notched out to fit with the corner moldings. I find the most accurate way to cut miters for the molding is with this micro-adjustable crosscut sled on a table saw. Of course, these funky angles in the back are more challenging. I basically rebuilt my crosscut sled to accommodate them. The top molding can now be glued and clamped into place. Next, we need to make these cheeks that project from the front of the case. This gets a little tricky because the keyboard cover needs to fit on top of the cheeks. To define where the cheeks go, I used 2 pieces of veneered plywood to simulate the lid and the cover. I temporarily attached 1/8 inch edging on the cheek. The top corner of the cheek needs to be notched out where it meets the top molding. And now I'll hold the cheek into position and mark it off to define its height. The cheek then gets veneered inside and out and the edging glued on. With the cheeks installed, we can complete the trim work by making the base molding. These pieces have a decorative profile on the top edge and they need to be mitered in the corners. The next challenge is to make the lid. The lid is going to be veneered plywood, of course, with solid walnut edging. To determine the plywood's dimensions, I'll use pieces of the edging in the front, left, and right sides. Fitting the angled back edge is going to be a little trickier. I'll temporarily attach the front, left, and right sides, then mark the back edge, subtract the width of the edging, tape on a straight edge, rough cut it on the bandsaw, and then cut it flush with the straight edge using a router. The edging then gets mitered, and some splines give it extra strength. I posted a separate video demonstrating how to do this pictorial marquetry. Before attaching the lid, let's route out a recess on the right side of the lid and case to hold the lid support. This is a little hairy, screw this up and there's no going back. With the lid installed, the final bit of casework is to make this keyboard cover. There's an upper cover attached to the lid with a piano hinge and a smaller lower cover. Because the cover is angled, there's not much room for screws, so the piano hinge's mortise is placed completely on the lid side. I'll cut that mortise with the router using a straight edge as a guide, and then square the corners off with a chisel. Fitting the cover is a bit of a challenge. I installed a piece of scrap wood to simulate the top edge, then more scrap to represent the bottom edge and lower cover. With these in place, I can now size the plywood field for the upper cover. The upper cover can now be installed and its bottom edge marked for a beveled joint with the lower cover. The lower cover itself has a skinny little plywood field veneered to match each design. Some masking tape is really the only way to clamp the beveled cover together. And with that, the casework is complete. I finished them with shellac. So that was the easier part. We still have to make them into musical instruments. First though, a little more decorative work for the inside. On my full-sized harpsichord, I get a lot of oohs and ahs from this delicate scroll saw work, so let's duplicate that on these smaller instruments. This design comes from a book of Victorian scroll saw patterns shrunk down to size and glued to 1/8" maple with rubber cement. Then comes the long, laborious process of cutting out each opening. Small holes drilled into the openings allow the skinny blade to be inserted. Each one of these 3 pieces took about 7 or 8 hours. The name board is typically where the maker autographed the instrument. I'm going for subtlety here, so I'll just insert my initials and the date. The beauty of using rubber cement is that it peels off easily, and any residue can be removed with an eraser. Similar techniques are used to make these decorative scrolls, which go inside the cheeks. The next major step is to make the liners. These pieces line the inside of the sound box and support the sound board. There's a right liner, a left liner, a rear liner, and the front liner, which is also known as the rack, goes about here. The right side goes in first. Remember that dado I cut in the base at the beginning? Well, the rack goes into that slot and it gets extended up into the right liner. In front of that slot, the liner gets cut down in height to form a little shelf. The register and rest plank are going to sit on that shelf. The liner on the left side gets cut down to that same height. And now the rack can be fit to size. The right side just fits into the dado, but on the left it needs a sharp bevel and needs to be notched to fit over the left liner. Cutting this sharp 21-degree bevel can be tricky. I find the best way to do it is to attach the wood with double-sided carpet tape to a 90-degree block. Here's what the rack looks like, but don't glue it in place yet. We still have to make slots in it to guide the keys up and down. With it in place though, the rear liner can be cut to size. As a finishing touch, chamfer the inside edges of the rear liner and rack. This little soundboard is so tiny, and these chamfers will increase the vibrating surface area. Next up, we need to lay out the balance rail. The key levers ride like a seesaw on the balance rail. Natural keys are balanced toward the front, and sharp keys towards the rear. Don't glue it in though, just screw it in from the bottom. We need to be able to remove it in order to make the keyboard. Can't put it off any longer. I tried doing this a different way and wasted about 2 months of effort. Here's a technique that does work. I started with a paper template and glued it to a blank made of basswood. The template has marks for the balance pins that go down into the balance rail. Then I pinned the key blank to the balance rail at the left and right ends and removed them together and drilled the balance pin holes through both at the same time. And now, with a carpenter square, I can transfer each balance point to the rack. The pins on the end of each key are a 1/16 of an inch, so with a 1/16 inch blade I can cut slots in the rack where I mark them. The rack can finally be glued into place. The balance pins can be cut down to length and inserted along with some felt punchings. A rear key rail along with some felt goes along the rack and helps dampen the sound of the keys falling back into position. With the scroll saw, I'll cut out each individual key and then mount it on its balance pin to mark the tail end where it meets the slot in the rack. Using this mark, drill a pilot hole and tap in the tail pin that rides in this slot. A little spacer ensures that they all stick out the correct amount. The holes in each key need to be elongated so they can rock back and forth on the balance pin. It takes a lot of fine tuning at this stage to make sure that the keys are all level and that the spacing between them is even. In front of each natural key are these little arcades. They're actually pretty easy to make with the drill press and 3 sizes of Forstner bit. There's a front key rail too, also covered with felt, that keeps the keys from clacking too much when you play them. The natural key tops are made from quarter-sawn Bubinga. It's very hard to plane it to a 1/16 of an inch, so this time I laminated together 3 layers of veneer. Once the tops are glued on, they have to be trimmed flush, first with a scroll saw and then with the router. The inside corner needs to be chiseled out by hand. Also, the shoulder of each natural key needs to be undercut slightly so it doesn't interfere with the neighboring sharp key. For the tops of the sharp keys, I'm using this wood. I think it's pronounced Wenge, and I think it's more sustainable than the ebony I used to use. There's a little problem here though with the sharps. They contact the front of the balance rail, making a clacking noise, so before gluing on the tops, I'll notch out a recess on the key's bottom and line it with felt. Not quite done with the keys yet because they need to be weighted so they return to level when you release them. I temporarily taped these fishing sinkers to balance the keys just right. Then I flattened them into a mushroom cap shape and inserted them into recesses drilled into the keys. I'll glue them in place once I'm sure that they work. A couple miscellaneous trim items to do. First, an upper lip hides the key well, and then a piece called the name batten goes under the name board. This piece is attached with screws so you can remove it to service the keys if necessary. After the keyboard, the register is the next most difficult part to make. The register holds the jacks in place, like this, so they can go up and down. It'll sit right here on top of the left and right liners, right in front of the rack. Its height will be set so that it will be flush with the top of the soundboard, which goes in here. Fortunately, I figured out how to do this for my other harpsichords. Starting with blocks of maple, I'll cut 2 dados across them, each precisely the size of a jack. To assemble these into a register, we need to space these out so that the jacks are more or less on top of the key tails. It doesn't have to be perfect, there's a little wiggle room here, but it can't be so far off that they interfere with the neighboring keys. Also, these have to be evenly spaced across the top here. This is kind of tricky to do, but here's what I came up with. Since these are identical, there's really only one variable, and that's how far along these are offset like this. Also, these are going to be sitting right about here, but for marking purposes we can push it right back to the line. With this corner set right at the point there, we need to find the spacing so that the next corner intersects the same point 2 keys down. By holding these together, we can measure the offset here with calipers. Now, each of these is slightly different, so let's move down and measure the next interval. Then keep marching down the keys and calculate the average of each of these offsets. With the calipers set to that desired offset, we can glue them up in pairs. Once the glue dries, we can assemble the pairs into a complete register. I then jointed the bottom flat, planed it to the correct thickness, straightened one side with the bandsaw and jointer, and then ripped it to width with the table saw. These jacks are extra long, so they can be used to position the register and cut it to length. The rest plank is a thick piece of maple in front of the register. It holds the tuning pins. It'll be under a lot of force from the strings, so I'll glue and screw it into place. Now it's time to switch gears and make the rose or rosette to fill in the sound hole. Traditionally, these were made from parchment or vellum. I've had some success using this flexible veneer, which is an extremely thin layer of wood supported by paper backing. I glued a pattern to a piece of veneer, punched out some holes with these hollow punches, and carved out the corners. I then glued this piece to another layer of veneer and carved that one. On top are two more layers shaped like rings with small holes drilled in them. The soundboard is almost ready to glue in, but first we have to attach the bridge. Like on a violin, the bridge transmits vibration to the soundboard. The other end of the string is secured by the nut. The problem is figuring out where to place the bridge and the pins that go into it. I traced out the sound well, marking the jack's positions, then drew in where the strings will go. Then I can locate the bridge so it's on the vibrating part of the soundboard. Once the bridge is glued on, I'll use the same tracing to find where the strings cross the bridge. That's where the bridge pins go. The pin locations are marked by drilling right through the tracing, then drilled to the correct depth. It's so much easier to do this before installing the soundboard. You wouldn't want to be hammering on it like this when it's installed. A spacer helps keep the pins the same height, which can then be perfected with a file. The nut is profiled just like the bridge and goes here on the rest plank. After gluing in the soundboard, a tiny strip of molding covers the joints all the way around. Anybody out there still with me? This process of laying out the strings is a real challenge. The next step is the hitchpins. These anchor the strings down into the thick liner on the right. They're in 2 rows, parallel, and hopefully in evenly spaced pairs. Once again, a small spacer controls the depth. After they're in place, I'll angle them slightly so the strings don't slip off. Next up, the tuning pins. With a spacer in the jack slot and a piece of thread, I can see where the string crosses the nut. The tuning pins then have to be shifted to the right a little so that the string bends around the nut pin slightly. The nut pins go in last, and their position is most critical. With a string in place, I'll locate the pin so the string just touches the spacer. One of my instruments didn't have enough of a bend around the nut pins, so I had to secure the strings with double pinning. The stringing's complete, and the last part of the puzzle is to make the jacks. I like these plastic jacks because they're dimensionally stable. They're assembled with a tongue and a plectrum, then trimmed to length, shaved down so they slide freely, and notched at the bottom if they overlap a neighboring key. Some small weights, hammered flat and glued in, help these little jacks fall back down. The jackrail goes on top of the jacks and prevents them from flying out of the case. There's a groove at the bottom for a couple layers of felt, and the corners are notched for some little mounting brackets. The brackets are mounted to the sides of the case. Some little rare earth magnets hold the jackrail in place, which needs to be removable so that you can service the jacks and do the voicing. Voicing is the difficult art of carving each plectrum so it gently plucks the string. With these tiny little strings, I found that whittling the plectra down to a point and thinning them out as much as possible creates the best sound. Finally, a little felt damper goes on the jack to silence the string. After tuning them up with a little clip-on tuner, let's take them for a spin. This is a standard tuning hammer. It has a little slot to fit the head of the tuning pins. But on this tiny little instrument, you need to turn the pins by just a fraction of a degree, and this short hammer just isn't precise enough. So here's how I made one with a much longer lever arm. First I'll turn the handle with a hole drilled into the tapered end. Then I'll take a length of 1/4-inch brass and cut a notch with a Dremel and a cutoff wheel. That notch fits the tapered end of the tuning pin. I'll bend the rod, cut it to length, and epoxy it into the handle. The final touch is to attach a little brass sleeve. Because the instrument is made out of wood, it's sensitive to changes in temperature and humidity. You pretty much have to tune it every time you play it, and this long tuning hammer makes that much easier.